Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Eric Aupperle and was Marriott's president during our NSFNET partnership. A year ago, just a little over a year ago as a matter of fact, earlier in November, Marriott had its 40th anniversary. And at that time, as part of that event, I convened a small group to begin planning for this 20th celebration of our NSFNET activity. The original group consisted of folks from IBM and MCI and Marriott and the National Science Foundation that had been active in our program. And subsequently, we added a few additional folks to represent ANS and some of the other constituencies. We've been very ably and effectively supported by staff from Marriott and IBM in planning for this event throughout the past year, and here with us today. Initially, our planning group conceived of what we were going to do today as a celebration of our own NSFNET program, that is our partnerships program. But in our initial meeting, we rather rapidly concluded that that was not the best, that we should expand the event to be inclusive of all the activities that preceded, occurred concurrently with our program, and subsequently over the many years that we've now enjoyed. It's also the case that our first meeting that we conceived the theme of the program, the partnership that changed the world, and that theme held up throughout the planning year. In that theme, the word partnership, we take to mean very broadly the aggregate set of academic, commercial, and governmental entities that led to today's internet under the leadership of the National Science Foundation. We invited about 400 folks, and there are approximately 200 of you here today. We hope you enjoy the program and enjoy the opportunity to exchange and greet old friends. With that, I'd like to introduce Doug Van Houweling, who during our Marriott NSFNET activity was chair of Marriott's board, and he is currently the CEO and president of Internet 2. Doug?
Thank you very much, Eric. It's a real delight to be here with all of you today. I'll have more to say about that in a moment, but right now I want to get right into our business together and introduce our first speaker, John Marburger, who is science advisor to President Bush and director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Prior to his appointment to the Executive Office of the President, he served as director of the Brookhaven National Labs beginning in '98, and he was the third president of SUNY at Stony Brook prior to that. He has California roots, however. He came from the University of Southern California, where he was a professor of physics and I didn't know this until I was looking into his background, but his special field in physics happens to be laser technology, something that turns out to be enormously important to this field today. He's also a well-regarded teacher, has done a series for CBS on the frontiers of electronics. He has a bachelor's from Princeton, a PhD from Stanford, impressive credentials, but I know that all of you will be delighted to hear from him today as he welcomes us to this city as we think about the last 20 years and probably some about the next 20. John?
Well, thanks for inviting me to say a few words on at the outset of this happy event. Few accomplishments merit a celebration more than this most significant milestone in the creation of the internet. Let's see, I'm going to put this down. Okay. That's good. The internet is a medium of unprecedented power, comparable in its impact on society to electrical technology or the system of transportation centered on the automobile. It has literally changed our lives and significantly altered the world's economy. It is not too much to say that the internet has changed the world's image of itself. Many, if not most of you in this room were closer to the NSFNET partnership than I was, but I've lived and worked through the entire history of the internet, beginning as an ARPA-funded investigator at the University of Southern California, as Doug said, before or as ARPANET got off the ground. And then subsequently I built up a digital infrastructure on campus when I was president of the Stony Brook University throughout the 1980s and into the early years of the World Wide Web. I began my research in 1967, an important date actually for ARPANET, and that work was computer intensive. And I longed for the access to number crunching that ARPANET would deliver within a few years. 20 years later, in 1987, I was already inundated with email, nearly all of it generated from our own campus at Stony Brook. And now it's 20 years after those first 20 years, and the world has changed. The extraordinary development of the internet during its second 20 years compared with its first 20 speaks volumes about the importance of NSFNET. NSFNET may have seemed a small step at the time, but it set networking off in a direction that turned out to be immensely fruitful. Ideas like NSFNET were in the air. After all, 20 years had passed since the first planning meetings that led to the ARPANET. And regional networks, some but by no means all based on TCP/IP, were forming around the country. In New York, we had NicerNet, one of whose founders, Richard Mandelbaum, is on today's program. Like the NSF-sponsored networks, NicerNet was a public-private partnership, a model that probably resulted from the fact that no one wanted to foot the entire bill for these early ventures, whose market appeared to be mainly poor academics. I recall that while I was president of Stony Brook at that time, we used the Stony Brook Research Foundation as a bank for the early days of NicerNet. It's worth recalling that the decade of the 80s began with the worst dip in the economy since the Great Depression. Huge federal budget deficits accumulated during the decade, and science funding was volatile and generally declining. When NSF created CSNet in 1981, which was one of the worst years of that recession, it was supposed to support itself after NSF's initial investment, with membership fees coming from the universities whose computer science departments were linked. I was never clear on where all the money came from, but I am aware that the private partners, many of whom are sponsors of this celebration, made substantial contributions of infrastructure. In my view, the intersectoral partnership quality of the various regional networks and NSFNet was as important as the use of TCP/IP and the link to ARPANET. When it came time for the government to step aside, the assets of the then existing internetwork were in private hands in a highly flexible arrangement that continues to confuse people to this day. This handoff of the internet from its government roots to private sector ownership needs to be better understood, and I hope this conference can shed more light on it. It has to be the most successful such handoff in history and one of the least understood outside the United States. And it's no better understood within the United States, but it's better tolerated because probably most Americans think we own it anyway. You're probably aware that there's a great deal of tension between the U.S. and other countries regarding this issue of the U.S. control of the internet. I was the U.S. delegation leader to two successive meetings, rounds of the Worldwide Summit on Information Society. And I had a hard time explaining to diplomats and communication ministers from other countries that no one really controls the internet. And this is one of its great strengths. And it is U.S. policy to ensure that internet governance remains in private hands, separate from any government. So how NSFNET ended in the mid-1990s in a distributed form of private ownership, highly unusual for a major component of a national communications function anywhere else in the world, is every bit as important as the creation of NSFNET in the mid-1980s we're celebrating today. The history of the internet is complex, and the role NSFNET played in it is much more complex than it seemed at the time. But the vision of its founders was very deep, and whatever lessons we can learn from their success should be crystallized in guidance for great ventures in the future. Speaking today as a federal official and as a representative of the federal government's interest in the nation's technical infrastructure, I want to express my deepest gratitude to you who had the vision and the ingenuity and the energy, not to mention the brashness and the impatience and the sheer stubbornness that was required to create this marvelous concept. And I want to emphasize that it was not only the software and the hardware, but also the way the entire system was built into the fabric of our society that has made the internet so successful. And that model was nascent in the original NSFNET approach. My congratulations to you all and to the organizers of what promises to be a memorable and important celebration. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marburger, for those wonderful remarks, and for someone who was a true veteran of what we were doing. You probably experienced more of it than you wanted to, but we do appreciate your starting off our program with such a thoughtful talk. I am Jane Cavanis. I was fortunate enough to start at NSF as program officer for NSFNET just prior to just as the competition for the NSFNET backbone project was being handled. The proposals had just come in and were being reviewed. And I, on the other end of my time at NSF, was there when, as Dr. Marburger talked about, the turnoff of the NSFNET backbone, in which we made the transition to the privatized world for backbone services. So from that perspective, Eric Aupperle invited me to participate on this program committee, and I want to welcome you on behalf of that program committee. Hope that you will enjoy revisiting, rethinking about the time, the work that went on, and also to reflect on what we can learn from what we did, from what everyone did, the partnerships that went on throughout all of this. There were interagency partnerships, there were university, corporate, government partnerships, state, federal. There were people just working together to get this done because it was so important. So again, thank you for coming, and I'm sure that all of you will contribute to making this a very successful conference and helping us look back and also look forward. I want to introduce to you next Doug Gale. Doug's credentials with this project start when he was at the University of Nebraska, and he helped organize MidNet, one of the early mid-level networks. And then after that, he came to NSF to succeed me as the NSFNET program manager. And for all of his time, professional time, he has been involved in some way with this project. He now has a project that is near and dear to his heart that he has persevered on in his spare time and wants to tell you about in helping us capture what happened over these years. So I introduce you to Doug Gale, who will speak to you about the Internet Archive project.
Thank you, Jane. Dr. Marburger provided a wonderful introduction for my brief segment. If you've looked at some of the popular histories about the Internet, one of the things that you'll notice is that there's a great deal of discussion about the ARPANET, which was, we all know, very important. And then there's suddenly a fast forward to the World Wide Web. My question is, how did we get from 213 hosts in 1981 to between 700,000 and 3.2 million hosts, connecting somewhere between 2.5 to 32 million people in 1994? Or perhaps stated differently, how did we get on the cover of Newsweek? What happened in those intervening years? They haven't been very well recorded. The objective of the Internet History Archive is to collect and archive both physical materials and oral histories. Now, we're not collecting that material just for historical reasons. There's a deeper reason. As we as a nation move forward, it's hard to figure out how to get from point B to point C if we don't understand how we got from point A to point B in the first place. So we're really trying to answer some questions. What combination of historical factors produced such an innovative and rapidly evolving new technology? What role did government, business, universities, and individuals play in realizing the modern Internet? What accounts for the unusual level of cooperation achieved between traditionally competitive corporate interests, as well as between private and public sectors? What lessons might be learned in terms of replicating this success for both government and corporate efforts to spur technological innovation? Is the increasingly cheap and easy flow of information made possible by the Internet a democratizing force for society? Is a democratizing manner in which the Internet evolved now embedded in its structure in a way that empowers individuals more than centralized powers? And the list of questions go on and on. I'm not going to read more of them. You'll notice the type gets smaller and smaller and smaller because we run out of space on the slides. The Internet History Archive is currently a volunteer effort. Substantial material has already been collected, well over 200 hours of audio and video information, as well as physical materials. The amount of information now exceeds what can reasonably be done with a volunteer effort. We need to find a permanent institutional home with professional archivists and librarians to manage the project. And that's the direction that we're going. All of the material that is being collected will be placed in the public domain. I'm happy to announce today we have created an advisory committee to help in the transition from a volunteer project, a hobby project, if you will, to one that's under professional management at an institution. Ken King, Steve Wolf, Al Weiss, Vince Cerf, Glenn Reichert, and Doug Van Houweling have agreed to form an ad hoc advisory committee to help us make the transition to ensure that this information is stored permanently at an institution to be available for scholars, researchers, policy analysts to try to understand what caused and how this phenomena occurred. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doug. A number of us had a chance yesterday to sit with our colleagues here in Arlington and reflect in front of video cameras and with sound recorders on some of this background. I can tell you that while there are moments of pain associated with remembering things, it's mostly a wonderful experience to sit with our colleagues and recall the things that, that we thought about and did together. And as Doug reaches out and we reach out to build this archive, I know you'll all be delighted to support it. You know, I've heard from a number of you as you've arrived here. A number of you have said thank you. It's really quite wonderful that we're all gathered here together today. For me, it is a great occasion for a number of us who worked so hard together to accomplish a goal that we all thought was so important, to renew our acquaintance, to review what we've been able to do after we parted ways, and to come back together and reflect on what we accomplished. Yeah, when Eric first was thinking about this effort, we said, well, when should we do this? You know, the NSFNET backbone actually is only a part of this story. But we decided to try to do it more or less on the anniversary of the announcement of the Backbone Network Award, which was actually in November in 1987. I want to take a moment before I get into my substantive remarks to thank a number of people who made this possible. First of all, our sponsors, Advanced Network and Services, Cisco, IBM, Internet2, Juniper, Marriott, and especially the National Science Foundation. All have contributed substantial resources to making this meeting a reality. And it was done through the services sort of in the internet style by a planning committee that was drawn from this broad community, chaired by Eric Aupperle, with Andy Rosenzweig and Ann Obie providing the sort of the key motive force behind it, but including Jordan Becker, Rick Bovee, Jane Cavanis, Tracy Downey, Ben Feynman, Doug Gale, Elise Garish, Larry Landweber, Barb Nanzig, Gale Turkhurst, Al Weiss, and Don Welch, all of whom have been meeting every Monday morning now for quite a few weeks. Of course, the Marriott and Internet2 staff are providing the support for this meeting. You've noticed, I'm sure, that there are cameras in a number of locations around the room. We are not the only attendees of this session. I'm not sure that this is quite at the scale that somebody once observed when they were sitting in the Michigan Stadium watching a football game and realizing that even though there were 100-odd thousand in the stadium, there were probably 1,000 times that many out on the television. And I can't claim that there are 1,000 times 200 watching across the world today, but there may be eventually that many because, of course, the other thing we're doing here is archiving all of these sessions. So they'll be available on the web for people to observe, even if they're not able to see them. But you know, the most important participants in this meeting are the panelists and all of you, because without you, we would not be here today. Let me say a few words about how the conference is put together, because it's important that I think we all understand the NSFNet was not the only it was only one of the significant elements of the development of today's internet. The fundamental technology in the protocol suite already existed as a result of the ARPANET work. And the folks who had the vision for the NSFNET at the National Science Foundation understood that the internet, if it were going to be a service that served the world in general, would have to become a commercial service. So in some sense, the NSFNET story is a story of a halfway house, a story between technology discovery and initial implementation, and the scaling and commercialization of that technology. And so in this meeting, we're starting out with the precursors, recognizing the shoulders on which the NSFNET project stood, and the formation then of the partnership that carried out NSFNET, and the stages of the development of the actual physical network. First of all, the T1 network and then the T3 network. And the extraordinarily important evolution of the organizational structure that took place in parallel with that, where we created a brand new not-for-profit organization called Advanced Network and Services to provide the network service towards the end of the project. And then, because the backbone was only a small part of this overall effort, we're going to focus on the community, the regional networks that played such an important role. And then talk about the impact. First of all, the impact on research and science. Hear from Eric Bloch tonight, who was the director of the foundation at the time of this project. Learn his reflections on the impact and the importance of the network and the issues we confront going forward. Then tomorrow morning, start off with a session on the impact on learning and teaching, and how this network actually became, as it developed, an international activity. Finally, some reflections on why things worked the way they did and where we're headed in the future. So this is your opportunity to hear from and share your ideas with your peers. This conference is very much like the NSFNET project. Many contributors to a common objective. Well, let's think a moment about the project itself. Originally conceived as a 5-year project, it actually went 7.5. Originally funded at $15 million, the funding from the NSF over the period was in excess of $55 million. But, very interestingly, there was at least an equal contribution from IBM, MCI, the state of Michigan, and Nortel to the overall effort. And those expenditures were the tip of this very substantial iceberg that we managed to calve, because there were also extraordinary expenditures to form the regional networks and major investments on the campuses to create the infrastructure and management. This was a period where we went in capacity of the network from 56 kilobits to 45 megabits, almost 3 orders of magnitude. And the usage of the network grew over this period, averaged more than 10% every month. The reach of the network started off 5 supercomputing centers. At the end, 93 nations. You know, this model of a network where no one is in charge, we discovered is a model that can scale. And of course, we all know that it has continued to scale beyond this period. There are some other aspects of this period that I think are important for us to remember. We not only built an infrastructure that was capable of scaling, we built a human model that was capable of scaling. There were hundreds and eventually thousands of people who learned how to build and operate internet technology networks across the world that started from the higher education community. Much has been said about the technology of the internet, but I'd like to focus here this morning on the transformation in the social and organizational form of technology, delivery of technology-based services that the internet represents. The internet was alien to the communications industry as it began to grow up. It was alien precisely because it had no point of central control. It was alien because it was not designed and capacity provisioned according to a carefully laid out capital plan by an organization that had overall responsibility for it. It all started in the ARPANET when a group of computer scientists decided they needed to make common access to computing a key aspect of the computer science research community. And from those beginnings, the internet was a community-driven, bottom-up kind of organizational and social model. In fact, I maintain that the scalability of the internet, while it is certainly the result of almost prescient development of the protocols, is more about the fact that there could be at first tens, then hundreds, then thousands, then hundreds of thousands of points of innovation in the development of the network. The protocols were very slim, they didn't constrain things over much, and they invited participation. Indeed, I've observed that probably the internet could not have come from anywhere but the higher education and research community, because I think we're the only community, at that time at least, who believe that very good things can happen when no one is in charge. Now, I think we also need to give extraordinary credit to the National Science Foundation, because the NSF understood, I think, from the beginning, this key transitional role that they needed to play. And so they managed this project with a firm but very flexible hand through the cooperative agreement, with the objective from the beginning of creating this bridge from the ARPANET to a commercial capability. And they understood, as they moved along this path, the way they had to behave at the NSF would be different than supporting their basic research. Indeed, they were focused on creating an infrastructure that would deliver what the scientific community in the United States and eventually the world would require. I think we also need to remember that we have a key organizational capability in our society which sits between what we think of as government and what we think of as private enterprise. It's the not-for-profit model. We had two extraordinary not-for-profits in this period. The first, Marriott. The second, Advanced Network and Services. Both of these not-for-profits formed a neutral meeting place for a joint investment by government and industry as we move forward. As a result, it was possible to build a platform that was not government, not industry, but in fact could be a halfway house between those two organizations, and it enabled the technology transfer to a for-profit enterprise in the final analysis. I think we too often in our work forget that there are multiple organizational tools that our society can use to achieve these visions. In this case, we used every tool that we had in our organizational and social structure here in the United States. Finally, I want to conclude by saying what must be obvious to everyone here, that this effort was a success not primarily because of the things I've just cited, but because it was an effort of extraordinary people with an extraordinary vision. I remember an evening, I think it was at Eric Aupperle's house, shortly after we'd received informal word that we were likely to receive the reward. And one of the folks there that evening, I hope the person is here today, although I can't remember for sure who it was, said, "You know, this will change the world." So the vision, the notion that we had our hands on a world-changing opportunity, I think is what led us to make the investment that we all made in creating this outcome. And the fact that you're all here today, I think, indicates that vision is still alive. And that our community still holds the promise for continued advances as we develop the networking technology that goes into the future based on the extraordinary innovations that are now happening in optical technology and control. Mainly, though, I want to thank all of you for being a part of this extraordinary project, and also congratulate you on what you accomplished. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug. Just a general comment about the flow of activities. We have scheduled very short breaks between most events, and so this is an opportunity for you, if you wish, to get up and stretch a bit, but don't leave, because very soon the first panel that will get started. So thank you all.